here's your host, Deborah Duncan.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Great Day Houston. Millions of Americans are looking forward to a long weekend with family get-togethers, cookouts, and lake adventures. But our first guest has another suggestion in the true spirit of Memorial Day. It may sound strange at first, but there's a lot to be learned and goes to the heart of our nation's history. We're talking about national cemeteries. Joining us with their origins, development, and purpose, including notables buried at the Houston National Cemetery, is historian Raffi Andonian. Good morning, Raffi.
Good morning.
All right, you're LA raised, and we certainly know the West Coast has a great history. Go West, young man, right? But you were also curious by nature and really loved a lot of things that were happening on the East Coast, which is really where a lot of America's history in terms of becoming a nation started.
That's right, and that's exactly what got me interested to move out east as a kid. I mean, as a kid, I was looking to the East Coast for some of the nation's founding history, and then once I became a young adult, I moved to the East Coast and I worked at the Gettysburg Battlefield, where, of course, there's one of the first national cemeteries, and that's how I got my start.
Yeah, and then you kept going with it. You created Raffi's Regulars.
Yes, so Raffi's Regulars is my history venture that incorporates many components of what I do in history. I have my 3 books that I've written on history. I have my own Apple TV show that I host and produce. I have a company program that I do called Harmonize Your Workforce that uses history as a way to enhance employee culture. And so there was kind of this series of history projects that started to happen. Of course, the birth of Celebrity Historian, which is how I go around on TV stations talking about historical topics. So that's how it kind of became this entrepreneurial venture based on my experience having worked at historic sites before.
Why is it so important for you to connect people to our history? And the way that you do it is not just telling the story. Oftentimes you'll go to a place like the home of Martin Luther King Jr. And so to connect that home, like a lot happened in that home that created him as a human being, right? And so why do you think it's so important for us to see that and experience that?
That's so great you mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. So I worked at the Martin Luther King home as well after I worked at Gettysburg. And one of the things that we tried to emphasize, which helps kind of illustrate your point, is that he was a little boy that actually was much like any other little boy at the time. And it's hard for us sometimes to go back to that, knowing his legacy and see him as a person, right? We kind of see it's hard to relate to him.
Yeah.
And a couple of things that really influenced him was heavy education and heavy religious values that came from his mother and his father's side. One side of the family was a lot of preachers, and the other side of the family was a lot of teachers. So that kind of really informed who he was and how he became that person. So we try to inspire people by understanding that.
All right, Memorial Day. There are those of us, grew up in a military family, so we knew early on what Memorial Day meant. A lot of people, if you went out in the streets and said, what is Memorial Day, will be confused. In fact, a lot of veterans will say, people will come up to them and say, Happy Memorial Day. And it's like, well, I'm a veteran, I'm still here, right?
I'm still alive.
Yeah, there is Veterans Day, but Memorial Day. So let's go back to the beginnings of that and what it really means.
Memorial Day has a series of beginnings. So these things rarely start with just, someone planting a flag and this is it. And there's a series of Memorial Days, if you will, throughout the country, sometimes politicized in the late 19th and early 20th century, a generation after the Civil War, but it really surrounds the death and people who died in the American Civil War especially is kind of what gives rise to the widespread celebration of Memorial Days until we nationalize it. So Memorial Day, to your point, is about people who died in war or as a result of war.
Yeah, all right, and so we nationalized it and it became an official holiday in 1971. And when you say that word memorial, oftentimes I'll talk to veterans and say, who's the person you think of when you think of Memorial Day? And oftentimes they have a story. But the thing that's interesting is that you talk about politicizing, it came in and out of favor. After Vietnam, people just kind of were like, it's the 3-day weekend where we go out and have fun with family.
Not only then, it came in and out of favor during and after the Civil War as well. So there's kind of these periods, if you will, that's political. Now, I will say what's interesting is, of course, you then now also have the establishment of national cemeteries, which predates Memorial Day, or Memorial Days, if you will. So there's different cemeteries that some were not national, some were, and national cemeteries are part of that national commemoration.
Yeah, and then of course after 9/11, everybody kind of came back around and wanted to know more and do more.
Present context affects how we look at the past all the time.
All right, the form foundation of national cemetery system.
Yeah, so what happens is to think about the national cemeteries first. The first national cemetery, although it's not called that at first, is surprisingly in Mexico City. So what happens during the Mexican-American War in the late 1840s is you have American soldiers, of course, that are fighting in and around Mexico. And there's kind of a divide, of course, between mostly Protestant Americans at the time and mostly Catholic Mexicans. So they were not being buried in the same cemeteries, nor did they want to be. So they're kind of haphazard graves, often without identification. And then what happens is that they end up being kind of in these unmarked graves. Later on, Congress authorizes to go in and reinter them in Mexico City. You can still go there. It's called Mexico City National Cemetery, established in 1850, shortly after the Mexican-American War. That's the first national cemetery that we really have. Then you hit the Civil War. Now in the Civil War, there's of course mass death and mass destruction. In fact, you have almost 700,000 people who died in the American Civil War. To put that in context, Deborah, what that means is if you take every other war in American history, including World War II, Vietnam, Revolutionary War, and everything, it barely eclipses how many people died in the Civil War. That's how mass death and destruction there was. So as a result, in the Civil War, you also had this kind of, we don't know what to do with all these bodies, even though it's in the United States. And so what happened is Congress authorized the president to purchase land on behalf for the government to bury people that died in battle. And that's how you get the first beginning of the national cemetery system. So for example, by the first year, you have 12 national cemeteries that are established in the 1860s. By the end of the war, the end of the Civil War, you have 27. And within 5 years after the Civil War, you have 73 national cemeteries. So it grows in a period of 6-7 years like that, from 12 to 73.
And every time I go to a national cemetery, or cemetery is pretty, but especially a national cemetery, I look and I say, this was the price of.
That's exactly
you
right.
Think back, was that a price that was worth it? And do we want to repeat that ever again, right?
That's right, that's right. And actually, it's funny you mentioned that because Abraham Lincoln, of course, delivered the Gettysburg Address at the Gettysburg National Military, or at the Gettysburg National Cemetery, also known as Soldiers National Cemetery. And that's one of the places I used to work. And I brought with me today this pen that actually is made of the wood that was there during, of a tree that was there during Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So this is known as a witness tree. The witness tree is a tree that literally witnessed, in this case, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and this pen is made of the wood. Very few of them, and I got it because I worked there. Lightning struck a limb, and we took the limb. I knew the woodworker, so don't worry, I'm not going down tearing down trees.
No, that's very cool.
But this really reminds me of that because he talked about the last full measure of devotion that they gave. Those are his words.
Wow.
And that gives you an idea of what we're talking about when you talk about the sacrifices that were done.
Houston has a national cemetery as well.
Yes, Houston National Cemetery, and it's notable because it was the only national cemetery that was established in the 1960s. It is one of 3 that has a hemicycle, which only exists in Arlington and in the Philippines.
You have to explain what hemicycle means.
A hemicycle is basically a semicircle.
Okay.
It's a semicircle. There's this huge semicircle monument there. That's one of only 3 in the national cemeteries to have it. But also, of course, you have notables that are buried in Houston National Cemetery.
Garcia.
Macario Garcia is the first Mexican-American immigrant to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Really fascinating what he did. He fought in Germany in World War II, was wounded in 2 spots, and he was crawling and overtook 2 enemy machine gun nests as he was wounded, refused medical care until he was able to defeat them with grenades, killed 6 of the enemy and captured 4 by himself until he got his until he was given medical care. He came back to Houston and was given the Medal of Honor by President Truman. And actually, one of the things that's kind of sad is he tried to enter a restaurant and he was discriminated. He was not allowed to go in because he was Hispanic. And he got into it with the owner. Police were called, and it became this big case and a symbol of how he could fight for his country and yet be discriminated. But of course, today you have a street named after him in Houston. You have a middle school named after him. And of course, the Army Reserve Center that
great
George
history
Bush
lessons
did.
to learn there too. It's interesting how the country galvanized and came together to fight over there while there was still a fight happening here.
That's exactly right.
Kermit Behan.
Kermit Behan was the bombardier of the second bomb that was dropped for the atomic bombs in World War II. So of course the first one was the Enola Gay, and his plane actually escorted that. And then the second bomb was dropped in Nagasaki. First one in Hiroshima, his with Nagasaki. He was the bombardier that dropped it. He called it looked like a picture from hell. That's what he used, the term that he used. And funny enough, he dropped that bomb on his 27th birthday. Now within a few days and a few weeks, the Japanese negotiations were done. Japanese surrendered, so
again,
a huge
that's the
impact.
Price of, right?
That's
the price of. Horrible thing that happened, but it ended that
That's
war.
right. Now, his Houston tie is that he was actually at Rice University on a football scholarship when the war broke out, and he joined the military, of course, led by Paul Tibbets for that Air Force unit.
Yeah, and then Dan Bankhead.
Dan Bankhead is, of course, buried in Houston because of the fact that he was a Marine. So his service as a Marine allowed him to enter Houston National Cemetery. But what's notable about him that I think in history, he was the first African-American pitcher in the major leagues. He made his debut next to Jackie Robinson on the Dodgers.
Very cool. All the stuff that's in your head. I can't remember. I want to climb inside your head one day. But Raffi, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks. What a wonderful time to be here to commemorate.
All right. For more information on Raffi and the historical presentations he can do for your group, because he goes out and speaks to different groups, visit greatdayhouston.com.